The sun shone brightly over a small neighborhood grocery store in Ohio, where the hum of daily life filled the aisles. It was a place where familiar faces greeted each other in passing, a community hub where shoppers went about their errands, lost in the rhythm of routine. But on this particular day, everything would change. As Daryl walked through the store, his attention was momentarily distracted by the buzzing of his phone. Dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, he moved effortlessly through the aisles, his basket in hand, scanning the produce section for oranges nearby. An elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses as she reached for a bag of apples. At first glance, she appeared unassuming, with her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair. But as Daryl reached for his own selection of fruit, something in the air shifted. The woman's eyes narrowed, her body stiffened, and without warning, her words pierced the calm atmosphere of the store. "You people don't belong here." Daryl froze, his fingers still hovering over the produce as his brain processed the words. The intensity of her remark shocked him, leaving him momentarily speechless. He glanced up, meeting her eyes, and there it was again, the sharp, cutting tone. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" A wave of discomfort washed over the nearby shoppers. Some stopped in their tracks, exchanging nervous glances, while others pretended not to hear, perhaps hoping the situation would resolve itself. The air in the store grew heavy with an uncomfortable silence, stretching far too long. Daryl stood still, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of her words, but what would he do next? The moment had arrived, and the crowd of onlookers was waiting. The store seemed to freeze, time itself standing still in the charged air between Daryl and the elderly woman. For a moment, his mind raced, his thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion, all swirling together, threatening to bubble over. The words she had thrown at him weren't just offensive. They were deeply personal, an attack not just on him, but on everything he stood for. The room felt smaller, the aisles narrowing as if the walls were closing in. Daryl's grip on his basket tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He took a slow breath, one that felt like it stretched into eternity, grounding himself in the present, in the tension that had enveloped them. His chest rose and fell with each inhale, the stillness of the moment almost suffocating. Everyone in the store was watching. He could feel their eyes on him, silently waiting for him to speak, waiting to see how he would handle this confrontation. The elderly woman, her chin lifted defiantly, stood before him like a challenge, unwavering in her bigotry, as if daring him to react in anger. But Daryl wasn't one to let rage dictate his response. He had been raised in a world that often sought to diminish him, that sought to make him smaller, quieter. His parents had taught him the value of staying calm in the face of hatred, to meet cruelty with grace. And yet, in this moment, even those lessons didn't seem enough. The words she had spoken, the venom in her tone, it was hard to swallow, hard to forget, but he had to. He had to find the strength to rise above it. The silence hung heavy, almost unbearable, as the woman waited, her eyes still locked on him. She clearly expected some kind of explosion, some furious rebuttal that would match the intensity of her insult. But Daryl didn't explode. Instead, he shifted his weight ever so slightly, making sure his movements were deliberate. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, cutting through the stillness with a quiet power. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, yet every word carried a weight that sent ripples through the onlookers. "Do you even realize what you just said?" The question was not accusatory, not confrontational. It was a genuine inquiry, a chance for her to reflect, a chance for her to see the impact of her words. But the woman was unmoved. Her expression hardened, and she responded with a sharpness that cut deeper than her initial comment. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The air in the store seemed to thicken. Daryl could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd, the tension rising. The murmurs, the exchanges of uncomfortable glances, they only added to the heaviness. For a brief moment, it felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break, waiting for Daryl to lash out, to give in to the anger she had so desperately provoked. But Daryl didn't let that happen. His jaw tightened, and his eyes met hers once more, not with fury, but with a kind of calm intensity that made the woman take a step back, just slightly. His voice was unwavering as he spoke again, letting the silence stretch between his words, allowing each one to land with precision. "All right," he said slowly, nodding his head slightly. "Let's talk about that." The crowd shifted, leaning in, the tension palpable. What was he going to say next? What could he possibly say to undo the venom that had been spat at him? The room was hanging on to every word, every breath as Daryl stood his ground. His composure unbroken, he placed his basket down with deliberate care, a small, almost insignificant action, but one that seemed to signal the gravity of the moment. He straightened his posture, his presence growing larger in the silence, like a force pulling the attention of everyone around him. He wasn't angry, not really. He was something far more powerful. He was calm, and in his calmness, he commanded the room. "My great-great-grandfather," Daryl began, his voice steady but laced with history, "was born in Mississippi. He was a sharecropper working land he didn't own. He broke his back every day, also his kids could have a better life. His father, he was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, and sold like property. And why? To help build the very country you're standing in." The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Daryl's words continued to land, one after another, like punches thrown with precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was cutting enough. "My grandfather," he went on, his voice gaining strength, "fought in World War II, fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to come back and be treated like dirt. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why?" The room was completely still now. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to stop. Daryl paused, his eyes locked on the elderly woman, giving her a chance to process his words. "Because he believed in this country's promise," Daryl continued, his voice softening but still full of conviction. "Even when it didn't believe in him, my parents fought too. Not with guns, not with fists, but by working every day, by raising me to believe in kindness, in respect, in hard work. My mother's a teacher. She spent her life helping kids, no matter what they look like. My father's a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." The woman stood there, frozen. Her hands were trembling slightly, clutching her apples, but no words came from her lips. Daryl's voice, though gentle now, carried a depth of emotion that seemed to shake her to her core. "So you're telling me I don't belong here?" he asked, his voice now tinged with sadness. "That I should go back to Africa? Well, ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it. In blood, in sweat, and in tears." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came. Her face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably, as though the weight of Daryl's words had become too much to bear. She took a step back, and for a brief moment, Daryl could see the faintest flicker of shame in her eyes. And with that, the silence continued to hang, but it was different now. It was no longer the oppressive silence of discomfort. It was a silence of reflection, of realization. The silence in the store stretched even longer, heavy with expectation, as Daryl's words settled in the air. The crowd seemed to collectively hold their breath, waiting for the elderly woman to respond. The moment was charged, like the calm before a storm. Everyone's eyes were on her. Every movement she made, every shift in her posture, seemed to carry the weight of the tension surrounding them. But she didn't back down. The woman's face, flushed with emotion, twitched slightly, and her hands tightened around the apples in her grasp. For a brief moment, it looked as though the words Daryl had spoken, words of history, of pain, of sacrifice, might have reached her. But then her chin lifted, her eyes narrowing, and something in her hardened. It wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge what Daryl had said. It was a deep, defiant resistance to seeing anything differently. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice louder now, sharper, like a knife cutting through the stillness. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to challenge her. The crowd around them shifted, uneasy, as if waiting for the eruption that would surely follow. But Daryl remained calm, his face unreadable. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Everyone was wondering how far this woman would go, how deep her hatred ran. Daryl's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, even as the crowd behind him seemed to pulse with anxiety. His calmness seemed to unsettle her, like a mirror reflecting something she couldn't face. The woman took a step forward, clutching her shopping basket tightly, her hands visibly shaking. She was no longer just defiant. She was desperate, like she was searching for something, anything, to maintain control of the situation. The store around them had fallen into a strange kind of stillness. The usual noise of shopping carts, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, and the soft murmur of casual conversation had faded away entirely. It was as if everyone in the store had been sucked into the vortex of this moment. No one moved closer to Daryl or the woman. They all stood frozen, watching like spectators at an unsettling drama unfolding before them. A young woman, holding a loaf of bread in her hands, gasped audibly. Her reaction rippled through the crowd, making the tension more palpable. But still, no one dared intervene. The elderly woman's words had pierced the air with such venom, and the weight of Daryl's response had left them all in stunned silence. Daryl's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Thoughts of his family's history, of all the generations before him who had fought and struggled for a country that denied them their rights. But as those thoughts raced through his mind, another thought surfaced. What good would it do to shout? To fight back with anger? He had faced so much worse than this woman's words. Her hatred didn't deserve a reaction driven by the same venom she had spewed. No, he had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response isn't the loudest one. Sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of control. The control he now had over the situation, over her. "So," Daryl said, breaking the silence with a steady voice, "you think I don't belong here, huh?" He wasn't asking a question this time. He was affirming the reality of the situation. "Well, let me tell you something, ma'am," he continued, his voice unwavering. "I've paid my dues here just as much as anyone. My family has. We've been here, building this country, working our asses off, even when we were told we didn't belong." The elderly woman's eyes flickered, but her mouth remained set in a tight line. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself. Daryl could see that. But the longer he spoke, the more uncomfortable she became. She shifted from foot to foot, the nerves beginning to show. Her defiance wasn't as strong as it had been moments before. But she still wasn't backing down. "I'm not done yet." Daryl's voice grew firmer, carrying a weight that seemed to carry across the entire store. He was calm, but the intensity of his words rang out like a bell, echoing in the silent air. "You say this is your country? Well, let me remind you, it's my country too. My people bled for this country. They fought for freedoms that people like you refuse to see. So yeah, I belong here, and I'm not going anywhere." The crowd had grown silent, each word from Daryl making them feel the force of his conviction. Some of the onlookers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another as if questioning their own beliefs. The woman's face was red now, her hands trembling with frustration, but she refused to speak. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words got caught in her throat. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, she seemed lost for words. And in that moment, Daryl didn't need to say anything more. His calm strength had already shattered her resistance. The weight of his words hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a truth too heavy for her to ignore. The store, once filled with the hum of daily errands, had transformed into something different. It was no longer just a place to buy groceries. It was a battleground of ideologies, of values, of humanity. And in that moment, it wasn't the woman's defiance that would shape the rest of the story. It was Daryl's unwavering response to her hate. The elderly woman's silence seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with tension. She stood there, her grip on the apples tight, her face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. Daryl could see the battle waging inside her, the conflict between her deeply held beliefs and the force of his words. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. Not yet. Daryl didn't move an inch. His calmness was a deliberate force, steady, unyielding. But it was not the calm of submission. It was the calm of someone who had seen much more than hatred and had learned to confront it without flinching. The room was charged, each breath held in collective anticipation. But Daryl's words had already begun to fill the space. He took another breath, letting the silence continue to stretch just a little longer. The crowd was still watching intently. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by, not without making it count, not without ensuring that something changed, even if just for a moment. The air felt thicker now, as if the world outside the grocery store had ceased to exist, leaving just this charged exchange between him and the woman. Finally, Daryl spoke again, his voice rising just slightly, cutting through the growing discomfort like a blade. "Since you brought it up," Daryl began, his tone strong, "let's talk about this my country of yours." His words were slow, deliberate, each one landing with a weight that made the woman stiffen. "You don't know me, you don't know my story, but you think you have the right to tell me where I belong?" He took a step forward, but only one, as if to close the space between them just enough to make his point clear. The woman's eyes widened, and for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. Daryl's voice never faltered, his every word filled with a quiet strength that seemed to echo in the hearts of everyone watching. "My great-great-grandfather," he continued, his words wrapping around the space between them, "was born in Mississippi. He worked the land not because he wanted to, but because it was the only option. He worked every day, breaking his back for a piece of land that wasn't even his. He didn't own a single thing, but he did it because he believed that if he worked hard enough, his children would have a better life." Daryl's eyes never left hers. He believed in this country, even when it refused to believe in him. The room was quiet now, the only sounds the soft shuffle of shoes on the tile and the gentle hum of the refrigeration units. Everyone was listening. The elderly woman's face was rigid, her features locked in place, but Daryl wasn't finished. His words were like a tidal wave now, gaining strength with every sentence, with every painful truth he revealed. "My grandfather," Daryl said, his voice rising in intensity. "He fought in World War II. He fought for a country that sent him overseas to die, to fight for freedoms he couldn't even enjoy when he came home. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. They called him a hero overseas, but when he came home, they treated him like dirt." Daryl paused, letting the weight of the history sink in. His jaw tightened, but his gaze softened. He stayed, though, because he believed that this country was worth it. He believed in the promise of a better future, even when it didn't believe in him. Daryl's voice was now firm, unwavering, as he turned to the crowd. "And my parents," he said, his words growing stronger, more resolute. "They fought too, not with guns or fists, but with their actions, their work, and their belief in something greater. My mother's a teacher. She spent her life helping kids, no matter what they look like. She taught them that kindness and respect are what matter, not the color of your skin. My father's a mechanic, the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help anyone, no matter who they are." He turned back to the woman, his voice still steady, but there was a quiet anger behind it now. "So don't you dare tell me that I don't belong here. My family paid the price for this country. They fought, bled, and sacrificed so that I, and people like me, could stand here today." The elderly woman's lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands shook as she gripped the apples tighter, but the defiance she had once held so firmly in her eyes was now beginning to fade, replaced by something else. Was it shame? Regret? Or perhaps it was simply the realization that she could no longer justify her words, that the history Daryl had laid out for her was irrefutable, undeniable. But Daryl wasn't done yet. He took one more step closer, his voice softening just slightly, but his resolve as firm as ever. "I could have walked away," he said quietly, his eyes now scanning the crowd as he addressed everyone, not just the woman before him. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. If we all just walk away from moments like this, we let hate win. We let it grow. It's up to all of us to be better than this." There was a heavy pause, and then, as if the spell had finally broken, the room exhaled. The silence was shattered by the quiet murmurs of agreement. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap spoke up, his voice breaking the stillness. "He's right," the man said, his words unsteady but filled with sincerity. "We have to be better than this." A few heads nodded in agreement, and an older woman in the frozen foods aisle murmured, "My dad fought in that same war." Her voice quivered, but there was a kind of pride in it. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The crowd began to shift, slowly, as if the tension had lifted, but the impact of Daryl's words lingered in the air. It wasn't just the woman who had been changed. It was everyone who had witnessed this confrontation. The bystanders, the people too afraid to speak out. They had seen what it looked like to stand up to hate with grace and dignity. And for the first time in a long while, the store felt a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. Daryl turned back to the elderly woman, who was still standing there, her eyes no longer defiant but filled with a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Something that looked almost like remorse. "It's not about what you meant," Daryl said gently, his voice softer now. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." The woman opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. She looked around, searching for someone to validate her. But no one did. She clutched her cart tightly, her face pale, and slowly turned to leave. As she walked away, Daryl stood still, watching her retreat. His heart beat steadily, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. It wasn't over. Not yet. But he had done what he came to do. He had spoken the truth. The tension in the store was electric, as though the very air around them had thickened with the weight of the words exchanged. Everyone was still, their eyes locked on the elderly woman who, despite her earlier defiance, was now retreating with an almost visible aura of discomfort. She didn't even look back as she wheeled her cart away, her steps hurried and uncertain. The sound of her wheels scraping against the linoleum floor seemed louder now, punctuating the silence left in her wake. But it wasn't just her departure that lingered in the air. It was the power of Daryl's words. The room, which had been suspended in a bubble of uncomfortable quiet, now began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously. The crowd that had been frozen in place for what felt like an eternity started to shift, their postures relaxing just a little, but their eyes were still wide, like they were waiting for something else to happen. Something to break the tension that had engulfed them. A man near the dairy section, who had been fidgeting nervously with his phone, put it down, his eyes still locked on Daryl. His face, usually unreadable, now showed a flicker of something. Admiration, perhaps, or awe. He took a step forward, and with a voice that cracked slightly, he spoke the words that seemed to snap the spell that had held everyone in place. "He's right," the man said, his voice almost breaking the quiet like thunder after a storm. "We have to be better than this." It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, the crowd seemed to exhale in unison, the weight of their collective breath releasing, like a pressure valve letting go. The young woman near the bread aisle, who had gasped earlier, now stepped forward. She had been frozen in place, her hands still gripping the loaf of bread she had been holding, her knuckles white with the tension. But now, she put the bread down, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My dad fought in that same war," she said, her voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of her words. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The old man in the produce aisle, who had been watching from a distance, nodded thoughtfully, his brow furrowed. The cashier, a young woman who had been watching quietly from behind the counter, called out, her voice filled with the kind of respect that could only come from witnessing something profound. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully," she said, her tone full of awe. "Thank you." And that's when the room truly shifted. It wasn't just that people were agreeing with Daryl, it was that they were feeling what he had said. It was like a light had been switched on in their minds, an awareness they couldn't ignore. A ripple of gratitude for Daryl's strength began to spread, and slowly, others began to move closer. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the action, the courage it took to confront hate in a way that didn't escalate the situation. The woman, who had initially stood at the center of it all, clutching her cart like a shield, was now nothing more than a shadow on the periphery. She had tried to dominate the space with her hate, but in the end, it was Daryl who had claimed the room. Not through anger, but through dignity, through the unwavering truth of his words. A few more people approached Daryl. A man who had been standing by the milk section, watching with wide eyes, gave him a soft clap on the back. "Man, that was something else," he said, his voice low and filled with admiration. "You're a bigger man than I could have been." Others echoed similar sentiments, some nodding, some offering quiet applause. The store had transformed into something different now, no longer just a place for shopping, but a place where something deeper, more significant had happened. The energy had shifted, people had been moved, and it was as if the collective consciousness of the room had been raised. Daryl stood there, surrounded by strangers, all of them offering their support. His eyes flicked around the room, scanning their faces. He had expected maybe an apology from the woman, but this overwhelming sense of collective change, it was something he hadn't anticipated. He had only wanted to speak his truth, but now it felt as though everyone around him was speaking it with him. They had seen, they had heard, and they were no longer willing to stay silent in the face of hatred. The elderly woman, still clutching her cart, had made it to the exit, but the room continued to hum with the energy of what had transpired. No one dared follow her. No one cared to. Her presence had been drowned out by the wave of truth Daryl had unleashed. But just as the store began to settle into a new rhythm, Daryl turned back to the counter where the young cashier was still standing. Her smile, though small, was filled with warmth, and unspoken gratitude for the courage he had displayed. "Sometimes," Daryl said, his voice softer now, "grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls." And just like that, it seemed like the walls around the store, the walls of silence, the walls of discomfort, began to dissolve. People shifted, adjusted their posture, and slowly, without even realizing it, began to return to their shopping. But it wasn't the same. The air felt different, lighter even. Like something heavy had been lifted. Daryl paid for his groceries and walked out of the store, but he knew that he had left something behind. Not just the lingering echoes of his words, but the realization that the fight for kindness, respect, and dignity didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it was simply a matter of standing firm in the face of hate, and the crowd, now slowly dispersing, would carry that with them. The woman's retreating steps grew softer, but her presence lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, as if the store itself was holding its breath. The clatter of her shopping cart against the tile was all that could be heard, and even that sound felt intrusive in the silence that had settled over the room. Daryl didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. His words had already done their work. The battle had been fought, not with anger or rage, but with quiet dignity, and the ripple effect was undeniable. But the woman, clinging to the last vestiges of her defiance, walked slowly, almost dragging her feet, as though she had aged a decade in the span of those few moments. Her once proud posture was now hunched, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her own thoughts. The air around her seemed to change with every step she took, and for the first time, she was aware of the eyes on her, the silent witnesses who had all seen her in her full ugliness, her hate exposed for all to see as she neared the exit, the faces of the onlookers, who had once been frozen in silence, unsure of what to do, were now filled with something else. It was not just judgment, though it lingered in their eyes, but a kind of quiet resolution. No one moved to stop her. No one spoke a word to defend her. The woman's words had been met with something far stronger: Daryl's truth, his grace, and the collective strength of the store's patrons. Her hands were trembling as she gripped the handle of her cart, the apples in her grasp now a symbol of something much darker than mere produce. She couldn't shake the image of Daryl standing there, calm, composed, unwavering in the face of her venom. She had expected a confrontation, a fiery exchange that might leave both of them shouting, but what had unfolded had been so much more powerful. The humiliation, the shame, it was all settling in now, seeping deep into her bones. She had not only been proven wrong, but she had also been made to feel the consequences of her words. She reached the door, the automatic sensor beeping as she passed through. The fresh air hit her like a slap in the face, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the first breath of someone who had just been found out. Someone who had been caught in the middle of a lie so ugly that it would take years to erase the stain. Out in the parking lot, she stood still for a moment, the weight of the store's atmosphere still hanging over her. She tried to breathe deeply, but each breath felt shallow, as if the oxygen itself had thickened with regret. Her hands, still clutching the cart, were slick with sweat. She glanced around, hoping no one would see the flush creeping up her neck, the red that had bloomed in her cheeks like a branding mark. The old woman's mind was racing now, each thought more chaotic than the last. How could I have said that? She questioned herself, but she couldn't seem to stop it. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment as if trying to escape the memories of Daryl's voice. The quiet power, the weight of his family's history, the truth that cut through her hate with surgical precision. What did I think I could achieve? She thought, clenching her teeth, desperate for any justification, but nothing came. Her own words echoed in her mind. You don't belong here. A part of her wanted to yell, to scream, to deny everything. But she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't help. It wouldn't undo what had just happened. There was no escape from the truth Daryl had delivered so calmly. She had tried to diminish him, to belittle his presence with a single hateful sentence, but in return, he had handed her a history she could not ignore, a history that laid bare the very foundation of her own country's contradictions. The air in the parking lot felt oppressive now. The sun, once a welcoming presence, seemed harsh on her skin, its light only making her feel more exposed. For the first time in years, the elderly woman felt the weight of her own smallness. She had spent a lifetime building walls around herself, walls of hate, fear, and denial. She had surrounded herself with the comfortable lie that people like Daryl didn't belong, that they were somehow less than her, less than the country she had fought for. But the walls had come down in that store. Daryl had torn them down with his dignity, with his calm, unwavering voice. And now, standing in the parking lot, the woman felt bare, stripped of her defenses. The walls she had constructed were nothing but fragile illusions that crumbled in the face of truth. The car door opened with a faint squeak as she climbed in, her movements slow, deliberate. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but the reflection staring back at her wasn't the one she had known all her life. It was a woman changed, a woman forced to confront the ugliness of her own beliefs, a woman who had just been taught a lesson in humility. She started the engine, the familiar hum of the car filling the space between her and the parking lot. But as she drove away, she knew she wouldn't soon forget this day. The memory of Daryl's words would linger in her mind, and for the first time, she realized that the seeds of change had already been planted within her. That it wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was the beginning. The air in the store had shifted. What had begun as an ordinary trip to the grocery store had transformed into a moment that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The crowd, once a passive group of strangers going about their errands, now shared something deeper. A connection, a collective awareness that the world around them could no longer be as it had been. They had been spectators in a silent battle, one where hate was met with dignity, and the weight of history was delivered with such grace that it left everyone feeling as if they too had been part of something larger than themselves. As Daryl walked out of the store, his steps measured but steady, the energy in the room slowly began to settle, but it wasn't the same. The store had transformed into a space of reflection, the normal rhythm of shopping and casual conversation replaced by quiet contemplation. The faces of the bystanders, who had once remained in the shadows, now seemed to glow with a new understanding. The tension had been broken, but what remained was something that could not be easily shaken. The realization that silence in the face of hate had its own consequences. A young man, standing by the dairy section, was still lost in thought. He hadn't even realized he had stopped moving until the elderly woman's cart had disappeared from view. He thought about the things Daryl had said, his grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, his parents. The way Daryl had spoken so calmly about history, about sacrifice, about the ongoing fight for dignity that had been passed down from generation to generation. He felt something stir within him, something that had long been dormant. For the first time in years, he felt compelled to stand up, not for himself but for others. He could no longer pretend that his indifference didn't matter. He had been silent for too long. As he continued to browse the aisles, his mind reeled. He couldn't help but think about his own beliefs, the quiet prejudices that had lingered in the back of his mind, tucked away in places he never questioned. What does it really mean to belong? He wondered. How often do we tolerate hate because we don't know how to challenge it? It wasn't just the words Daryl had spoken, it was the way he had spoken them. Calm but powerful, truthful but without anger. There was strength in his restraint, in the way he didn't give in to the urge to lash out. He had stood in front of a woman who had tried to dehumanize him, tried to strip him of his right to exist in that space, and he had responded with history, with humanity, and with a quiet dignity that left no room for retaliation. The young man, still holding his carton of milk, felt as if he had been given a new lens through which to view the world. What if I had been in Daryl's shoes? He thought. What if I had been the one confronted with hate? What would I have done? But the lesson wasn't just about how Daryl had handled the situation. It was about how the rest of them, everyone who had been in that store, had reacted, or rather, how they hadn't. They had watched. They had remained passive. They had stayed quiet. The woman had been allowed to say those words, to put those thoughts out into the universe without any immediate consequence. She had been allowed to walk away without anyone challenging her. In that brief moment, silence had been complicity. The more the young man thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became with that silence. He realized now that the greatest thing he could do, the most important thing any of them could do, was to not let these moments go unchallenged. But there was something more profound than simply confronting hate. The lesson Daryl had taught wasn't just about speaking up, it was about how we live in this world. The elderly woman had tried to isolate Daryl, to erase him from the very fabric of the country that had been built by people like him. But Daryl's story had shown the truth. None of the people in that store were truly separate. They were all connected in the struggle for equality, in the fight for recognition, and in the simple human need to be seen as worthy no matter their race, their background, or their history. As the young man made his way toward the checkout, he realized something important. It was up to him now to carry this lesson. It was no longer enough to be indifferent. It was no longer enough to simply observe. Every word, every action, every decision mattered. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he could no longer pretend that his silence wouldn't have an effect. If Daryl could stand up with grace, if he could transform that hateful moment into an opportunity for truth, then so could he. And that wasn't all. The woman, too, would have to face the consequences of her actions, but not in the way she expected. The shame, the embarrassment, would follow her long after the incident. But perhaps, just maybe, Daryl had planted a seed of reflection in her. A seed that would grow slowly, painfully, as she grappled with the consequences of her words. Maybe it wouldn't happen today or tomorrow, but eventually, she would be forced to face the truth of what she had done, and the truth that Daryl had spoken. The lesson had been simple yet profound. When confronted with hate, don't let it go unchecked. When faced with ignorance, don't remain silent. Because silence in the face of hate is not neutrality, it is complicity. And if one person could make a difference with the weight of truth and dignity, then maybe, just maybe, so could they all. The impact of Daryl's actions rippled far beyond the walls of the grocery store. What had begun as a simple confrontation, an unexpected moment of confrontation between two individuals, soon became a powerful example of how dignity and truth can break through the harshest of barriers. For those who were present, it wasn't just about what had been said. It was about how it had been said. Daryl's strength didn't come from anger or confrontation, but from his unwavering ability to remain calm in the face of hate. His quiet grace in the midst of such a hostile encounter changed something within everyone who had witnessed it. As he walked out of the store that day, Daryl didn't know the profound effect his words would have. He didn't know how deeply they would touch the hearts of those who had watched, silently holding their breath. But that was the beauty of his response. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't seek applause or validation. He simply did what felt right, standing firm in his truth. And because of that, his actions spoke louder than any words could. For the people in that store, Daryl's lesson wasn't just a reminder of the painful history of racism, but an invitation to take action, to reflect on their own role in creating a world that values kindness, respect, and equality. The young man in the dairy section, who had been lost in thought, felt his own perspective shift. He understood now that it wasn't enough to simply witness an injustice. It wasn't enough to be silent and hope that things would improve on their own. Daryl had shown him that standing up, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, was the first step toward change. And that change didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it just needed to be bold and quiet, like Daryl had done. It wasn't just about confronting hate when it's directed at you, but about challenging it wherever you see it. Every individual in that store, every person who had watched the incident unfold, now carried with them the responsibility to do better. They understood that their own silence in moments like these had consequences. By standing by and allowing hate to go unchallenged, they too were complicit. But the lesson Daryl imparted was simple yet profound. Silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates the cycle of hatred. Speaking out, confronting hate with grace, is how we begin to break that cycle. As for the elderly woman, the shame and discomfort she felt were not easy to ignore. It would follow her. The words Daryl spoke, so deeply rooted in truth, would linger in her mind long after she left the store. Perhaps she would never admit it openly, but she could not escape the reality of what she had said, nor the impact it had on those around her. And maybe, just maybe, those seeds of doubt would grow into something more. A shift in her perspective that, with time, would help her see beyond the narrow walls she had built around herself. But Daryl's actions weren't just transformative for the people in that store. They were also a reminder of the greater movement at play. In a world that often feels divided, where hatred and prejudice seem to rear their ugly heads at every turn, Daryl's response was a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that every individual has the power to make a difference, to challenge hate, and to stand up for what is right. His simple yet powerful act of grace showed that we all have the power to shape the world around us. And that's the heart of the lesson here. Change starts with us. Whether it's standing up to a stranger in a grocery store, speaking out against discrimination, or simply treating others with kindness and respect, each one of us plays a role in creating the world we want to see. Daryl's story is a call to action, a call to look within ourselves and ask, how can I make a difference? How can I challenge hate and ignorance with grace and truth? If you've been moved by this story and want to see more content that encourages thought-provoking, meaningful conversations about the world around us, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. We're here to create a space where positive change can start with just one action, one voice, one person at a time. Together, we can make a difference, one story, one lesson, one step at a time. So, let's not let Daryl's powerful message fade into the background. Let it fuel us. Let it remind us that we all have a responsibility to be better, to do better, and to ensure that the world we leave behind is one of kindness, compassion, and justice for all. If the story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button and join the conversation. Together, we'll continue to spread messages of hope, strength, and understanding, making the world a brighter place, one action at a time.